Ever feel like you're constantly playing catch up with this economic roller coaster? I mean,
Yeah.
you're not alone.
It is a wild ride.
It is. Today, we're going to dive into some recent predictions about where the Fed might be taking interest rates and also unpack some really fascinating 2024 migration trends. So get ready for some serious aha moments, especially if you're thinking about buying a home, relocating, or just trying to understand, which way the economic winds are blowing.
Right. Yeah, what's really fascinating is how these two topics, like interest rates and where people are choosing to live, they seem separate, but they're actually really deeply connected.
Totally. And we've got this awesome article from Florida Realtors that really digs into those potential interest rate slowdowns. And they have some insights from the Federal Reserve
Oh, cool.
and a bunch of different economists. Plus, they've got this really cool data from the recent migration survey.
Oh, wow.
So let's start with those interest rate predictions. The buzz initially was all about the Fed cutting rates 4 times in the coming year, which would have been like music to anyone's ears
Yeah.
who's looking to borrow money.
Absolutely.
What?
But it seems like things have shifted a little bit. The latest from experts is suggesting that those 4 cuts might get trimmed down to just 3,
Oh, really?
probably happening in December, March, and June.
Interesting. So what's making the Fed tap the brakes a little bit?
Well, recent economic reports have been surprisingly strong, and inflation is proving to be stickier than we thought.
Okay.
So when inflation is sticky, it means it's not going down as quickly as economists would like, even with all those interest rate hikes that has been happening.
Right.
The Fed is in a tough spot here if they cut rates too quickly.
Yeah.
They risk reigniting inflation. But if they move too slow, they could actually end up stalling economic growth altogether.
It's a delicate dance for
Yeah.
sure. And speaking of dancing around a decision, we even have a quote from Jerome Powell himself emphasizing the need to avoid rushing those rate cuts. He said, "The economy is not sending any signals that we need to be in a hurry to lower rates." What do you think about that?
I think it really shows how cautious the Fed is being right now. They're really trying to find that sweet spot
Yeah.
where they can control inflation without, like, tanking the economy. And I think Powell's statement really shows they're data dependent.
Uh-huh.
They're watching all those economic reports like hawks
Yeah, like Hall.
before making any big moves.
So for like the average person out there, what might this slower rate cut pace actually mean? Like, could we be looking at higher mortgage expenses for longer?
It's definitely a possibility. It could also impact business loans, making it more expensive to borrow money and invest.
Oh, wow. So it makes it pricier to borrow money in general.
Basically. So yeah, if you're thinking about buying a house or starting a business, those interest rate trends are definitely something to watch.
For sure. Now let's look at how these economic forces are playing out in real people's lives by looking at those 2024 migration trends.
Okay.
The Florida Realtor Survey showed that 40%
Wow.
of their clients moved to be closer to family and friends.
That's huge.
It's a huge number.
Yeah, it makes you wonder why this trend is so strong now. Is
Yeah.
it like a post-pandemic shift with people kind of reevaluating their priorities and saying, hey, family and friends are really important? Or are economic factors like the rising housing costs or inflation making multi-generational living more appealing?
That's a really good question. And I'm also really curious about that 21% of people who moved for more affordable housing,
Right.
which seems like it's tied to those economic factors.
Totally. It really seems like those interest rate hikes might be pushing people to areas where their dollar stretches a bit further.
Yeah. And speaking of stretching those dollars, the Sun Belt continues to be super popular. 40% of movers are heading south.
Wow, it's like a modern day gold rush, except people are searching for sunshine and affordability.
Right. Instead of the actual gold.
Yeah. Exactly. And I mean, with the lower cost of living and the favorable tax policies, and of course the weather, who can blame them?
Right.
Especially when interest rates are so high and it's harder to afford a comfortable lifestyle in other parts of the country.
It seems like people are voting with their moving vans,
Yeah.
making decisions based on, what makes sense for their families and their finances.
Absolutely. And here's something that I found really surprising. Only 2% of the moves were because of return to office policies.
Really? I would thought that number would be a lot higher, especially with all these companies trying to get people back in the office.
Yeah, it seems that working remotely and having that flexibility is winning out. People want to work from anywhere, and it's having a big impact on where they decide to live.
So the big question is, how will these two trends around them, the potential slowdown in interest rate cuts and all these changes in migration patterns, how are they going to play out in the long run? Because if those interest rates stay high, are people going to keep flocking to those more affordable places like the Sun Belt? Or are we going to see some totally new migration patterns pop up?
It's a really interesting question, and it's something we'll be exploring more as we continue this deep dive.
Stay tuned.
It really is like a puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Trying to figure out how all these pieces fit together, economic policy, individual choices,
Yeah.
technology, and, how they're shaping where people choose to live.
It's like we're watching this giant social and economic experiment play out in real time.
Totally.
But let's zoom in a bit and look at some of those details from the Florida Realtor Survey, for
Yeah.
example. It looks like suburban areas are still really popular. 41% of people moved from a city or urban area out to the suburbs.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a trend we've been seeing for a few years now, people wanting more space, maybe for home offices or just a change of pace from, the busy city life. And of course, with so many people working remotely, that tied to a certain job location isn't as strong anymore.
Right. And speaking of a change of pace, resort areas are also attracting a good number of people. 44% of movers are choosing those spots.
Oh, wow.
Maybe it's the relaxed lifestyle. Maybe it's just that dream of walking to the beach every day.
Right. Who wouldn't want that?
Exactly. But it is interesting to note that 36% of movers stayed in the same state.
Oh, okay.
So they might be moving to different cities or towns, but they're staying within the same area.
So are we seeing more of a shuffle within states rather than people moving across state lines?
Well, not entirely. The data also showed that when people did move across state lines, the most popular spot was the South.
Oh, really?
40% of movers went to a southern state.
The South is calling.
It really is. It all goes back to that Sun Belt appeal. We talked about the affordability, the jobs, the lifestyle. It seems like a winning combination for a lot of people.
For sure.
But, it's not just about finding a place to live. It's also about the type of home people are looking for. The survey found that 94%
Wow.
of recent buyers chose a permanent residence.
Okay.
Only 6% wanted a second home.
That's really interesting. It seems like this isn't just a temporary move for most people. They're putting down roots.
Yeah, they're making long-term decisions.
Exactly.
So what are those homes like? What are people looking for?
Well, outdoor space is huge. 42% of buyers said that was a top priority.
Yeah.
It seems like having a yard or a patio or just, some connection to nature is becoming more and more important.
I can see that, especially with more people working from home and spending more time at home. Having that little piece of the outdoors can make a big difference.
It really can, and it's not just about the outdoor square footage is also really important. 31% of buyers specifically looked for homes with more space.
Makes sense. I wonder if that's because people need a home office, or maybe their families are growing, or, maybe they just want more space to breathe.
Yeah, probably a mix of all those things.
Right. It's interesting how individual needs and wants bump up against what's actually available in the housing market. And even though being close to work might not be the driving force it once was, it's still something people think about. 43% of buyers considered that.
Interesting how that ties back to the remote work trend we were talking about. Only 2% of buyers moved because they had to go back to the office.
Right.
So while the job location might still matter, it's not the main thing for most people.
It feels like we're seeing a real shift in priorities, affordability, family lifestyle, outdoor space, square footage. So a lot of different things.
It is. It's really fascinating to see how it's all unfolding.
And all this is happening while those interest rates might be slowing down.
Right. It's a lot to unpack.
For sure.
Yeah.
But it's really important to remember that the economy and the housing market, these aren't just, abstract ideas.
Yeah.
They're about real people making real decisions about their lives.
Exactly. Choices that are shaped by so many things. Interest rates, inflation, remote work, even just wanting a better lifestyle.
It's a dynamic situation for sure.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to see how it's all playing out.
And it's not just interesting, it's really impactful too. These trends have real implications for communities' infrastructure, even politics.
You're right. I think about the resources in those areas that are booming, like the Sun Belt,
Right.
housing, schools, transportation. They all need to keep up with the number of new people moving in.
It makes you wonder if they're ready for all that growth. And on the other hand, what about those areas that are losing people?
It's a good question. Some areas might have trouble keeping up with services and keeping their economy going.
It's true. It's a complicated equation for sure, with some areas doing well and some not. And it's happening differently everywhere you look.
It's like a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Each move leads to a bunch of different consequences.
Yeah.
But how do we even begin to understand it all? How can we predict where these trends are going and what's going to happen in the long term?
That's the big question, isn't it? We can't know for sure what the future holds, but we can try to put the pieces together, look at what's happening now, the economy, people's preferences, technology, and make some educated guesses.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about, but it's good to be aware of these trends and how they might affect us and our communities.
Right. It's all about being informed and making smart choices, and maybe even helping shape the future.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into interest rates and migration patterns, what's the big takeaway for our listeners?
Hmm. I think the main thing is that things are changing really fast, and the decisions that big institutions like the Fed make, they really do affect people and businesses and the housing market.
Yeah.
So whether you own a home or rent or invest or you're just trying to understand what's going on around you, knowing about these trends is super important for making good decisions about your own future.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, sometimes the most interesting stories aren't the ones in the headlines, but it's how people are adapting to these changes.
Yeah, it's those personal stories and choices that really show us how these big forces are affecting people's lives.
Exactly. So think about how these trends might affect your own finances or your plans.
Yeah.
Maybe you will even want to do your own deep dive into the data.
That's a great idea.
Who knows, maybe your own story will become part of this bigger picture.
It could.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
It was great to be here.
And to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep an eye on those economic wins.